In order to earn a scholarship, you really only need three things. In this video, I'm going to walk you through what those things are, why they're important, and how you can apply them to your recruiting process. If you don't know who I am, my name is Jack. I run D1 Scholarship. We help high school athletes and transfer athletes navigate the recruiting process. To date, we average over 80% open rates, 70% click-through rates on videos, and we have multiple athletes with double-digit interest. Okay, so there's really only three things that you fundamentally need if you want to get a lot of interest and offers from college coaches, or if you're doing this with your kid. Okay, those three things are talent, evidence, and exposure. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through what those things really mean and how you can do them well, and how they are going to impact your recruiting process. So the first thing we're going to talk about is talent. Okay, because in the recruiting process, there's really only two things. You have talent and you have marketing. And so when we talk about evidence and exposure, both of those go into the marketing category, and then you have the talent category. Now, if you don't have talent, then there's no amount of marketing that can solve that problem, right? Your kid has to be good enough to play college sports in order for marketing to actually do anything for you. And so that is the first piece that has to be there. Now, the good news is that you're probably watching this video not because your kid is getting trounced by all these other athletes, but because your kid is showing some amount of promise. They're playing well. They're better than the other kids that are on the field, or the tournaments that you're playing at, the showcases, whatever it is. And so my guess is that the talent piece is probably in place. And so the issue that you're running into now is some sort of exposure piece. So when it comes to talent, talent is inversely proportional to marketing. What that means is that the more talent that you have, the less marketing that you need to do. So the top 10% of players, they don't have to do very much marketing because they are so much better than everyone else that they're just sort of going to get found. But the other 90% of players have to do marketing. And the less skill that you have, the more marketing you have to do. Then at some point, if you don't have enough skill, if that skill drops to a certain level, which is just an arbitrary level, then there's no amount of marketing that can save you. I'm going to look at my notes real quick to make sure that I've covered everything within talent that we need to talk about. Now, like we said, the good news is that if you're watching this video, then there's a good chance that your kid is good enough to play college sports, because you're not watching this video trying to figure out how can I get my kid a scholarship if they're not good enough for that to happen. So you probably don't have a talent problem. You probably have an exposure problem, a marketing problem, right? Because you might be one of those parents that's looking at your kid and you're going, okay, my kid is better than these other kids in the area, but in our area, these other kids are getting more interest from college coaches than my kid. How is this happening, right? And that is not a talent problem. Your kid might be a better player than them. That's an exposure problem. And luckily, an exposure problem is significantly easier and faster to solve than a talent problem. So then we have to dive into the exposure piece, right? And the second piece would be evidence. We cannot just say or think or believe that your kid is talented and good enough to play in college. We have to actually prove it. We need evidence that proves that your kid is good enough. And the way that you should be thinking about this is that your kid is essentially in the recruiting process on trial, okay? You're on the recruiting stand, and college coaches are asking, what is the evidence that your kid is good enough for my school and that your kid is the perfect player for my team? And the more evidence that you provide showing that, the more interest you are going to get, right? If you were on the stand in your own trial in court and a jury was trying to decide whether you're guilty or not, how much evidence do you want on your behalf that you are not guilty? All of it, right? It's the same thing in the recruiting process. You want as much evidence as you can possibly get. And the more evidence that you have, the more confident a player or a coach is going to be in a player. You talk a lot about the transfer portal, right? Everyone's worried about the transfer portal, especially high school athletes. And people are saying, how do we navigate the transfer portal? How do we compete with these junior college athletes, these college transfer athletes? And the simple way to put it is that you need more evidence than those players to prove that your kid is actually really good, because it's a much riskier bet for a college coach to go after a high school player than a college coach to go get a college player. And so it all comes down to evidence. Now, you might be thinking, well, stats are great evidence. You hear this a lot of times. Stats are great evidence. Stats are not good evidence, and there's a reason for that, and it is that stats lack context, right? You could say that a player is a really good player because they have great stats. But what you don't know is what competition did that player play against? How good was that player's team? What were the weather conditions like? There's a lot of context that you're missing in that stat, and that context matters. If a player has a great stat, but they're playing in South Dakota where maybe there's not a talent hotbed there, the talent is weaker, then that stat doesn't really mean that much. Whereas if you have a great stat in a talent hotbed in a bigger city, right, in Los Angeles or New York or Florida somewhere or Texas somewhere, right? And so now that stat means a lot more because of the context. And so college coaches know this, and they don't rely on stats because they're not as trustworthy. And so the pieces of evidence that college coaches actually trust, there's really three of them. They can watch you in person, they can watch your video, or they can get a recommendation from a coach that they trust. Those are the only three kinds of evidence that college coaches actually really care about. Now, they are going to look at your stats. They're going to look at them, but they're going to put more stock into what they see with their eyes than what some stat on a page is telling them. So when you're trying to figure out how much evidence do I have that's going from my kid, it's not about their stats. In fact, you could have weak stats and still get a lot of interest and offers from college coaches if you have a ton of evidence in those other three categories of in-person, video, and recommendations. So there's two things that really stand out when we talk about evidence. They have to be in place, okay? It's quantity and ease of navigation. So I want to go back to this lawyer comment because I think that it makes a lot of sense, okay? So if you're a lawyer or you have a lawyer and you're in court on the stand, you want two things. You want as much evidence proving your case as possible. When the lawyer says, "Can you get me some evidence?" and you say, "How much?" that lawyer is going to say, "As much as you possibly have." You could never have too much. And so we want a large quantity of evidence, but then imagine that you get this incredible amount of evidence and then you just dump it on a lawyer's desk. He's going to be like, "What am I supposed to do with this?" It's going to be completely overwhelming, and some evidence might get lost in the bunch. We don't want that to happen. And so not only do we want an incredible amount of evidence, but we also need to make that evidence easy to navigate. And so those are the two pieces that when we talk about evidence, we have to make those accessible, and those have to be present. So that is why when we work with athletes, we recommend YouTube, because YouTube allows us to do this. Instead of just posting videos on Huddle somewhere or on some recruiting profile or recruiting software, YouTube allows us to not only add a large quantity of evidence, but also make that evidence really easy to navigate. So when we start talking about video, we can create lots of different videos of different skills. We can have playlists separating those different skill sets. There's a lot of little things that we can do that are going to make college coaches' lives easier. And so we are going to accomplish the best of both worlds. We're going to have a large quantity of evidence, and then that evidence is also going to be easy for coaches to navigate. Because here's what the deal is. At the end of the day, your recruiting process is like a ship. Okay. And if a ship has holes in it, the ship will sink, right? Pretty standard. So what are those holes in the recruiting process? They are skills that your kid needs to showcase and that college coaches are looking to evaluate. So whatever position your kid plays, there are probably 4 to 7 skills that they have to showcase that college coaches are going to want to see for their specific position. And your job is to get evidence for every single one of those skills. Let me give you a couple examples. Let's say your kid plays baseball and your kid is a catcher. There are a few skills that catchers need to showcase that college coaches are going to want to see. They need to be able to hit. They need to be able to receive and block and throw. You can see there's the thumbs up thing. They're going to need to be able to have some strength, maybe some speed, right? And so then the idea is, can we get evidence in each of those categories so that there are no holes in my recruiting ship? A coach can't come along and say, well, he can hit, but can he throw? I don't know, because there's no evidence in that category. We can't have that happen. There can't be any holes in the recruiting ship, and so we need to satisfy every single one of those categories. Another example would be, let's say your kid plays football and he's a wide receiver. If he's a wide receiver, there's a couple skills that he needs to be able to showcase. And so maybe you have deep ball routes, you have short routes, you have catching in traffic, you have blocking, you have speed, you have strength. And so all of a sudden, we have all these holes in our recruiting ship, and we're just trying to plug them with evidence. And as long as there are no holes in the ship, it is going to be much easier for us to get interest from college coaches and to build confidence that your kid really is the perfect player for their team. And then this leads us into the third and last category, which is exposure. College coaches are not just going to stumble across your kid's evidence unless they're in the top 10% of players, and most are not. Unless they're in the top 10% of players, you have to do some amount of marketing to put your kid in front of college coaches. Otherwise, they're just going to go get another player that they happen to stumble across. And that is not what you are looking for. You want your kid to be that one that they come across. So we have to do some legwork in order to make sure that that happens. And so we need, exposure really is, at the end of the day, getting enough coaches to see your evidence enough times. So we need unique coaches, so not just 10 coaches or 10 different schools. We need 100 different schools to see your kid, and then we need each one of those schools to see multiple pieces of evidence of your kid. That is exposure. If you're missing either one of those, then you don't really have exposure. If you only get 5 unique schools, there's only 5 schools that have ever seen your kid play, even if they see him play 100 times, you're not getting very much exposure. But also similarly, even if you have 100 schools, unique schools that see your kid play, if they each only see your kid 1 time, then you're not getting the maximum amount of exposure because they're probably going to need to see your kid multiple times in order to be convinced that they really are a good player and that they're the perfect player for their team. And so exposure ultimately comes down to getting enough college coaches to see your kid or to see evidence of your kid enough times. And so at the end of the day, we talk about this one word when it comes to exposure, and that is volume. Okay, volume of work, more videos, more emails, more follow-ups. And I know that that's not fun to hear, and nobody wants to talk about that. And everyone wants to say that there's some hack to the recruiting process. Listen, I've been doing this for a while. We have a lot of success. There's no hack to the recruiting process. There's not. Anyone that's telling you that there is trying to sell you something that does not work. Period. At the end of the day, it comes down to volume. The more schools that you reach out to and the more videos that they see of you and the more times they see you in person and the more follow-ups that you send to them, the more interest that you're going to get. And so exposure at the end of the day comes down to volume. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is establish direct connections with college coaches. I think that a lot of times parents and even just athletes use showcases and camps and recruiting events as their primary method of exposure. They think, okay, college coaches don't know who I am. Coaches go to showcases. I should go to showcases. I'll play well. And then coaches will see me as a good player and they will recruit me. But it often doesn't work out like this. College coaches often go to recruiting events to watch players that they are already in contact with, players that they've already heard of. So if you aren't in contact with coaches before the event, it's unlikely that you're going to be in contact with them after the event. And so showcases and other recruiting events should not be your primary method of exposure. You should be generating exposure another way, either through email or social media. And then once you have those connections, it becomes significantly easier to choose the recruiting events that you should go to. Because if you're talking to 5 schools, then you know it's probably worth your time to go to those camps and those showcases over some showcases to schools that you've never had any contact with, they haven't expressed any interest. And so instead of having to go to 50 showcases throughout the year, you can just go to the ones that are going to give you a much higher chance of getting an ROI. And so when we talk about exposure, we are trying to get the most volume, but we are also trying to get the most efficiency. How can we get the most out of the work that we are doing? And so this is how you get interest and offers in the recruiting process. It's not by putting together a 3-minute highlight video, sending it to a couple coaches, going to a few camps, and calling it a day. You're gonna have a really hard time in today's recruiting world. It's different than it was 3 years ago or 5 years ago. Heck, for sure different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And so this is the game that we have to play now. And we can either complain about that game and say, well, it shouldn't be like this, and this is a lot of work, and this is a full-time job. Yeah, it is, but it's also required. And so if you want to win the game, you have to play the game. So I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea of kind of what the recruiting process actually looks like. Everything you do in the process should fall into one of these 3 buckets: talent, evidence, and exposure. If you need help in the recruiting process and you want to explore what it looks like to work with us, I'll leave some links down in the description below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video.